Buenas noches. Infinitas gracias por venir hoy aquí con la que ha querido. Yo he tenido que hacer uso de mi título de patrón para cruzar el Zapillo y ha habido gente que no tenía título y está todavía ahí, atascada. La verdad que eso es muy de agradecer que cuando se ofrecen actividades culturales, científicas tan interesantes como la que esta semana estamos desarrollando aquí, pues siempre Almería responde de una manera extraordinaria y la verdad que me siento pues, muy orgulloso, ¿no? como almeriense. En primer lugar, pues me gustaría agradecer a todas las personas e instituciones que hacen posible la celebración de las jornadas astronómicas en Almería, que ponen a Almería como centro de la astronomía mundial durante esta semana, especialmente a Pedro San José, alma mater del evento. Hoy culminamos una semana intensa que ha puesto a Almería en el mapa de la astronomía. La Universidad de Almería siempre apoyará iniciativas científicas como estas jornadas que tanta relevancia e interés despiertan como entre todos nosotros. Una muestra clarísima es que están todos ustedes hoy aquí con la situación que acabamos de pasar. Es para mí un honor presentar a Ana Fischer como colofón a las magníficas jornadas astronómicas de Almería. Ana es astronauta, habiendo cursado estudios de medicina, matemáticas y química. Hoy nos va a hablar de nuestro futuro en el espacio. Tuvimos la suerte de charlar con ella el pasado martes en la Universidad de Almería, donde nos comentó que estaba muy feliz de estar en Almería y de haber visitado nuestra universidad, que le recordaba la suya, la Universidad de California de Los Ángeles. Es la primera vez que visita Almería y confiamos que no sea la última. Tuvo que buscar Almería en el mapa porque no la conocía y se sorprendió. Y por otro lado nos comentó que dejar a su hija cuando tenía 14 meses para salir al espacio fue lo más difícil que tuvo que hacer en su momento, pero que se siente muy orgullosa de toda su trayectoria profesional. De su viaje al espacio destaca una sensación de felicidad y asombro por las vistas. Según Ana, desde allí no se ven fronteras y te sientes realmente parte del planeta Tierra, independientemente del lugar de donde vengas. Por supuesto, ella ama todas las diferencias culturales, pero desde allí nuestras diferencias son minúsculas frente a las similitudes. Ana cree que a medida que más personas tengan la oportunidad de ver esa increíble vista desde el espacio, tal vez aprendamos a cuidar mejor a nuestro planeta y a todos los que vivimos en él. También nos dejó un mensaje muy emotivo a nuestros estudiantes, animándolos a estudiar y a encontrar lo que realmente les apasiona. Si se encuentran en un área con la que no están tan contentos como pensaban, es el momento de crecer, de explorar, que no tengan miedo al cambio. Ella lo hizo. Ella iba camino de un centro médico, se había convertido en una doctora y estaba cursando estudios superiores. Y cuando llegó la oportunidad de ser astronauta, pues no lo dudó, no lo pensó dos veces y siguió este nuevo camino. Ana, we are delighted to have you in Almería. It's an honor for all of us to be able to meet you. We look forward to hearing from you. Ana, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diego. I'm very happy to be here in Almería, and especially I want to thank all of you. I can get up and walk. Yes. I want to thank all of you for coming this evening, especially on any night I would be happy to speak to you, but especially tonight. You certainly show a lot of courage coming out in this storm, so I think many of you are ready to be astronauts yourself. But thank you so much for also, with a storm like this, making me feel welcome, because we have storms like this in Houston many times a year. So what I'd like to ask real quickly is how many people, even if you don't speak English fluently, understand English? Could you raise your hand so I have an idea of how many? So quite a few of you understand English. Okay. But we're still going to translate into Spanish, but it just helps me know. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started because I have a lot of slides. I'm very passionate about the space program, and I'm very excited to share that with all of you.
Pues dice básicamente que está muy agradecida por la audiencia porque han mostrado cierto grado de coraje en llegar hasta aquí, que no es poco. Y después dice que tiene mucho que decir porque es apasionada en cuanto a su propia profesión y espero poder explicar esto a vosotros.
I'm very happy to see all the young people here this evening, and I like to start out with a slide of when I was a little girl, so that particularly the young children will realize that you also started out as a child, and it was a lot of hard work to get to be an astronaut.
Para los niños más pequeños aquí, ella ha querido mostrar su retrato de niña para explicar que ella ha tenido que estudiar mucho, trabajar mucho para llegar hasta donde llegó, pero ustedes también, vosotros también podéis hacerlo.
I was very shy as a child. If I had known that to be an astronaut you had to speak in public, that would have frightened me far more than launching on the shuttle. But I was also very much a nerd. I loved science and I loved math. And I was 12 years old when I first had the idea to be an astronaut, when I listened to Alan Shepard, the first American man to launch into space for his suborbital flight.
Ella estaba muy tímida de niña. De hecho, me daba más miedo hablar en público que lanzarse al espacio. Pero también era lo que se llama nerd, una dedicada a la ciencia en general. Y cuando tenía 12 años, le inspiró el vuelo de Alan Shepard, el primer astronauta norteamericano que lanzó en espacio.
It did not seem like a very realistic goal at the time because all the astronauts were men, they were test pilots. Women were not allowed to fly in high-performance aircraft to even have the chance to be an astronaut. But nonetheless, the seed was planted, and I knew that is what I wanted to do someday if I ever had the opportunity.
Era especialmente difícil porque todos los astronautas eran hombres, incluso la mayoría de pilotos de pruebas, y estaba prohibido para chicas, pero de todas formas ella quería y sabía que quería ser astronauta.
My father was in the military, and we moved a great deal, so that when I was in 8th grade and we settled in the Los Angeles area, 8th grade was my 13th school.
Su padre era militar, se movían de sitio en sitio mucho, y cuando llegó a 13 años a Los Ángeles, estaba en su 13º colegio.
I was very happy to live in one place and make friends, and I was very fortunate to get into the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, where I started out in math, but eventually decided to pursue my bachelor's in chemistry.
En Los Ángeles hacía amigos y después tuve la buena fortuna de entrar en la Universidad de California a Los Ángeles, UCLA, UCLA, para vosotros, y empezó a estudiar matemáticas, pero cambió y su graduación, su licenciatura de química.
I love studying science and math, but I also wanted to combine that with my love of working with people. So I decided to go to medical school. And I still had not entirely lost sight of my dream to be an astronaut, because I thought even if I wasn't able to be a career astronaut, maybe someday I could be a doctor on a space station.
Pero después le gustaba trabajar con personas. Entonces entró a estudiar medicina. Nunca había perdido el deseo de ser astronauta, pero pensaba, bueno, si no puedo ser astronauta de verdad, podría ser quizás una médica, una doctora en una estación espacial.
While I was in my medical training, just by pure chance of having a lunchtime conversation with one of my medical school friends, I found out that NASA was looking for astronauts for the new space shuttle program, and not just pilot astronauts now, but mission specialists also, or scientist astronauts.
Por casualidad, en conversación con una amiga, se dio cuenta que la NASA estaba buscando astronautas y ahora no solamente pilotos, sino también científicos, los especialistas en misión, entonces para el transportador, que era nuevo. Entonces, se decidió.
I found out 1 month before the deadline, and it took a month to get all the paperwork in, your transcripts, letters of recommendation, and then about 6 weeks later, found out that I was, after my application was in, that I was in the first group of women being interviewed for the space shuttle program.
Se dio cuenta un mes antes de la fecha tope, tardó un mes en preparar toda la documentación, lo preparó, y 6 semanas después recibió la noticia que estaba en la primera tanda de personas elegidas para pasar por las pruebas de verdad de astronauta.
And then in January of 1978, I found out that I was in the first class. I was very fortunate to be in the first class of astronauts selected for the space shuttle program, the largest class NASA had ever selected, and as you can see, the most diverse.
En el año 78 recibió la muy buena noticia para ella que estaba en la primera clase de los seleccionados de la NASA para astronautas del transportador. Es una clase bastante grande y con bastante diversidad.
There were 35 of us, 15 pilots, 20 mission specialists.
35 personas, 15 pilotos y 20 científicos.
And the first group of women, I was very fortunate to be in the first group of 6 women selected for the U.S. space program.
Y 6 mujeres en este grupo, solo 6, ella una de las primeras 6.
Dr. Shannon Lucid on the left, Dr. Ray Seddon next, Dr. Kathy Sullivan, a geologist, Dr. Judy Resnick, an electrical engineer who unfortunately died on the Challenger, myself, and Dr. Sally Ride, the first American woman to go into space. And unfortunately, she passed away in 2012 from pancreatic cancer. And I don't expect you to say all
no
the
recuerdo
names.
los nombres, pero I'll pick up on todas. Una, Sally Ride, que era la primera mujer en entrar en el espacio de Estados Unidos. Bueno, también lamenta la pérdida de uno de los en el transporte que se perdió y otro que murió de cáncer.
There's another picture of us at water survival training.
Bueno, durante la formación para supervivencia.
And an artist at the Kennedy Space Center designed a patch that you see here for the 6 of us.
Entonces, ese es ¿cómo se llaman estos patch en español? Bueno, se pega al traje con las 6, los nombres de las 6.
There were 2 women who flew before we flew, Valentina Tereshkova for the Soviet Union shortly after Yuri Gagarin, the first human to leave our planet.
Entonces, esa era la primera mujer en el espacio, era soviética, Valentina Tereshkova, no mucho más tarde que el primer hombre, que era Yuri Gagarin.
And then Svetlana Stavianskaya flew a few months before Sally, and she was the first woman to do a spacewalk.
Entonces, esta señora, también rusa, un poco antes de Sally Ride, ella era la primera mujer de andar, hacer andaduras en el espacio.
We're based at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas.
Basados en el centro Johnson en Houston, de Texas.
You can see it looks very much like a university campus, and this is where all of our simulators are located and where we train for the Space Shuttle program.
Toda la formación ahí, había simuladores, pinta un poco como un campus universitario.
It's very different for the space station program because training is all over the world with our partners, but I don't really have time tonight to talk about all of that.
Well, no va a entrar en los detalles de diferentes formaciones o diferentes programas.
When you're first selected as an astronaut for about a year or so, you're called an astronaut candidate, or as NASA affectionately calls us, ASCANs.
Entonces, un año antes del vuelo, selecciona como candidato o candidata astronauta o ASCAN.
After that, you get different jobs in the office. One of my first jobs was to work in the area of spacesuits and spacewalks, and they didn't even have a suit that fit me. I had to wear Pete Conrad's suit because he was one of the shortest of the Apollo astronauts, and this is an Apollo suit, not a shuttle suit.
Pues ella trabajó en la zona de los trajes espaciales, pero cuando ella empezó no había un traje lo suficientemente pequeño para ella. Entonces tuvo que poner el Pete Conrad, el de Apolo, el más pequeño de Apolo. Y ese es uno de Apolo.
A little late, I had many other flights and assignments, and one of them was to work at the Kennedy Space Center, helping get the shuttle ready for my fellow astronaut colleagues. Here, I was the lead person for Sally's flight.
For?
Sally's flight.
Ah, okay. Entonces ella estaba después delegada al centro de Kennedy, en Cañaveral, para asistir y ayudar en la preparación de los vuelos de los otros. Y ella está aquí preparando para el vuelo de Sally Ride, la primera.
What you don't realize is I'm about 8 months pregnant here.
Pero lo que no se ve es que está embarazada de 8 meses.
And when I returned back to Houston after Sally's flight launched, my boss, the head of flight crew operations, called me in and said he wanted to assign me to a flight. At the time I was 8.5 months pregnant, 2 weeks before I delivered my daughter.
Entonces dijo el jefe que quería asignar a un vuelo cuando ella estaba dentro de 1 mes y medio de dar a luz.
So when my daughter was born on a Friday, about 2 weeks later, and on Monday morning, I was at the pilots meeting that we have every Monday at 8 a.m. to make sure that everyone knew I intended to honor my commitment to go into space.
Su hija nació un viernes. El siguiente lunes ella asistió a la reunión de los pilotos para mostrar que ella estaba muy en serio en comprometerse a volar.
One of the first things you do when you're assigned to a crew is design your patch. And so here, this patch has the names of all the crew members around it, 2 satellites that we are going to deploy from the shuttle, and then for the first time in history, we were going to go into space and bring back 2 satellites whose rocket failed to take them to geosynchronous orbit.
Pues entonces esta es lo que ellos diseñaron para su propio vuelo, que contiene los nombres naturalmente y 2 satélites que van a poner en órbita del transportador, y también por primera vez iban a rescatar 2 satélites cuyos cohetes habían fallado y no estaban en órbita correcta.
And since I was helping design the patch, there were 5 stars for each of the crew members. And since I was the first mom to fly in space, I added a star for my daughter, Kristen.
Hay una estrella para cada miembro de la tripulación y ella añadió otra estrella porque era la primera madre de volar en el espacio. Esa es la estrella de su hija Kristen.
You won't read that little fact in the book about patches. There's a book about all the patches. that story.
Hay un libro que explica todos estos detalles.
About 6 weeks before your flight, you have a press conference, and again, because I was the first mom to fly in space, they wanted pictures with Kristen.
6 semanas antes del vuelo, NASA quería que ella apareciera con la hija, y esa es la foto.
There's another one.
Esa es la foto.
About 2 weeks before your flight, you go to the Kennedy Space Center for a practice launch, and here are my fellow crewmates.
2 semanas antes del vuelo había una práctica de lanzamiento. Ella está allí con sus amigos de tripulación.
It's also the last time that you get to look at the particular payload that you're going to take to orbit, when the payload bay doors are still open.
Es la última vez que vas a ver los instrumentos que vas a llevar a órbita, mientras que las puertas del transbordador están todavía abiertas.
Can they see the slides okay, or is the light too? Can everybody see the slides okay?
Bueno, fairly well.
Maybe they could turn the lights down a little bit.
Está preguntando si se pueden bajar las luces aquí un poco. Sí, no del todo.
Perfect, thank you. So, and this satellite here that we are going to deploy is identical or similar to the one that we are going to try to retrieve on orbit. There are 2 satellites like that on orbit that we're going to bring back.
Entonces, este es un satélite que van a poner en órbita. Es muy similar a los que van a rescatar y devolver a la Tierra.
Oops, wrong way, sorry. Oops, I'm going backwards there.
Bueno.
Sorry. So this, we launched on November 8th, 1984. Here you see us walking out from the same doors that almost every crew since Gemini has walked out of. And you'll see in a later slide of one of the recent crews walking out of that same door from crew quarters.
Es el día del lanzamiento, están saliendo de una puerta en el edificio y es la misma puerta donde todos los astronautas durante años han salido hasta actualmente también.
Another little known fact is as I'm walking out here, I'm looking to see, I know my mom is there with my daughter Kristen, and I was looking because I wanted to see her one more time before I went into space.
Estaba mirando a ver si podía ver su hijita por última vez antes de ir al espacio.
This is what it looks like inside the cockpit with the commander at the upper left, the pilot, Mission Specialist 1, and Mission Specialist 2. That was me, that is my seat. I was the flight engineer on the flight.
Pues es la cabina de control, el piloto, el segundo oficial y los 2 científicos. Ella está allí, donde ella indicó, y ella fue también el ingeniero del vuelo, también, además de los instrumentos.
When the space shuttle lifts off, there are over 7 million pounds of thrust, getting its thrust from the 2 solid rocket boosters and the 3 main engines, receiving its liquid oxygen and hydrogen from the large orange external tank.
Pues cuando se levanta un cohete de este poder, son 7 millones de libras de fuerza, de 3 cohetes de fuel sólido y también 2 de fuel líquido, que es oxígeno e hidrógeno, todos a la vez.
Now what I would like to do is try to give you a brief description of what it is like to launch into space. If you can imagine your seat and you lay the back of the chair on the floor and you've been sitting out on the pad for about 3 hours waiting to launch, and the video is about 1 minute and it's going to start at about 15 seconds before liftoff.
Pues hay que imaginar, ella va a presentar cómo se siente un lanzamiento desde el punto de vista del astronauta, que hay que imaginar que estás dentro del cohete, estás en un tipo de sofá, está horizontal, durante 3 horas antes y después, en un periodo de 15 segundos, todo ocurre.
And I think for this part, I'll just talk in English, and at the end, you can summarize what I said,
Okay.
because it goes pretty quickly. Okay, with that, imagine you're now 15 seconds from liftoff. The computer says the command to stop and when the three, after they're satisfied that that is working well, command is sent to the solid rocket booster. And when the solid rocket booster is ignited, you may not know where you're going. You definitely know you're going somewhere. Once the solid rocket boosters are ignited, you cannot shut them off. At about 2 minutes into flight, the fuel is depleted, and the computer sends a command to jettison the solid rocket boosters. You'll see there are parachutes on the solid rocket boosters, and they're recovered in the ocean. After that first 2 minutes, the ride is as smooth as glass. It's a constant acceleration up till about 3 Gs. And what that means is on the ground, if you weighed 100 kilograms here on the ground, very briefly you would weigh 300 kilograms. It's a little uncomfortable, but not really very bad. And then at about 8.5 minutes into the flight, the main engines shut off. And you go from 3 Gs to weightlessness in an instant.
May I say that I couldn't hear much of what you were saying when the rocket was going up.
Okay.
So
well, I can just say real quickly, when the engines, at about 15 seconds, the commands from the computers are sent to start the 3 main engines, and then the 3 main engines start. When they're okay, they send the command to ignite the solid rockets.
Sí, cuando dice ignición, en 15 segundos los ordenadores encienden los primeros motores, los principales motores que dan el lift-off. Sí.
So you go from 0 kilometers per hour to 26,500 kilometers per hour, which is orbital velocity, in about 8.5 minutes.
Entonces vas de 0 kilómetros por hora a 26.000 kilómetros por hora en 8 minutos y medio. I'll say something else. Ella dijo que durante la parte suave de aceleración, la aceleración da el peso del cuerpo 3 veces el peso normal. Y de repente, al apagarse los motores, vas de pesar 3 veces a 0 veces el peso normal. Okay.
Thank you. So now I'm going to just show you very briefly what it was like to be in space and live on board the space shuttle. And even though the shuttle isn't flying anymore, there are a lot of similarities to the space station and other vehicles I'll show you later in my talk.
Pues va a dar una cuenta de cómo es estar en el transportador, y aunque ya no vuela el transportador, es muy similar a cómo es en la Estación Espacial Internacional y otros, así que es muy general.
Here you see our Commander Rick Howe on the flight deck. You can see it's very similar to the cockpit of a commercial jet.
Ese es el comandante Rick Howe. Se nota que el panel de control es muy similar avión de pasajeros.
This is the aft flight deck. Once you get on orbit, you don't need the seats that the two mission specialists were sitting in, so we stow them away.
So es la parte de atrás. Una vez están en órbita, no hace falta los asientos de los científicos, entonces estos se ponen a un lado y se guardan.
And so this panel here, on this, the commander and pilot can fly the shuttle to, as we're going to do, join with the satellites, or in later missions to dock with the space station. And from over here, I can operate the robotic arm.
De la parte de la izquierda, el piloto puede maniobrar para acoplarse a la estación internacional o ir a buscar satélites. Y de la parte derecha, ella opera el brazo maniobrable, el brazo robótico maniobrable.
The mid-deck is where everything else happens, where you prepare your meals, where you do scientific experiments. You can see I'm holding onto the handle of our treadmill for exercise.
Pues esa es la parte intermedia, ni delante ni detrás, donde la mayoría de las cosas ocurren, donde preparan las comidas. Ella está haciendo ejercicio con una cinta de ejercicio que hay ahí.
We each had a locker where we could stow our personal things, and as you can see, we could fly our university affiliation or your military affiliation, and of course, my picture of my daughter. The necklace that I'm wearing is the necklace I'm wearing now, if you're interested in seeing it. And as you can see, there's no such thing as a flat hair day in space, because even your hair floats.
Sí, pues, entonces hay un tipo de pequeña cabinita donde ella puede poner sus cosas personales, que hay, que incluyen obviamente la foto de su hija. Lo que está pendiente alrededor del cuello en la foto es lo que tiene puesta ahora mismo.
A little bit about sleeping in space. It was very strange the first night. I created this little hammock arrangement between two sleeping bags, which was very comfortable.
La primera noche dormir en espacio era muy peculiar. Ella había preparado un tipo de hamaca que pueden ver ahí.
But even I had gotten used to sleeping by just floating. This is a picture my crewmate Joe took, and you can see there's a tether to my jacket, to the handle of the treadmill, and I'm fast asleep. I didn't even know he took this picture until we got back on the ground.
Pues entonces un compañero de ella puede dormir donde esté y se nota que está atada al aparato de ejercicio, pero ella ni se daba cuenta que el compañero tomaba la foto hasta que aterrizaron después.
A little bit about going to the bathroom in space. Everyone wants to know, but nobody wants to ask.
Sí, ¿cómo vas al baño en el espacio? Todo el mundo quiere saberlo.
The waste management, this is our pilot, Dave Walker, and hopefully he's just simulating here.
Es el piloto, Dave Walker, y ella espera que solamente es una simulación que está haciendo.
But as you can see, it's very much like a porta potty that you would see at a festival or a marathon, something like that. And it uses vacuum assist to help things along. And I think I'll leave the rest to your imagination.
Bueno, entonces es muy similar a los portátiles que están en festivales, etcétera, etcétera. Y se usa el vacuo para ayudar en retirar la materia, y ella no quiere decir más.
But I will say that You do not go to the bathroom quickly, whether for number 1 or number 2, you've got to really think ahead and plan because it takes time.
Entonces, una regla, no hay que ir, dejarlo, hay que planificar bien, porque tarda un poco más ir al baño allí que en otros sitios.
The one thing that NASA added when we started flying mixed male-female crews was this privacy curtain. But as you can see, you really don't have a lot of privacy. So if you want to be an astronaut, you're going to get to know your crewmates very well.
NASA instaló una cortina durante las misiones con tripulación mixta, pero la intimidad es muy difícil de preservar. Y si vas a ser astronauta, llegas a conocer muy bien los compañeros.
So real quickly, I'm just going to tell you what we did on our flight because it was a very historic flight. No one had ever done anything like this before.
Pues yo describí su vuelo porque era histórico. Tenía aspectos irrepetibles.
On day 2 and day 3, we deployed the 2 communication satellites that I showed in the earlier slide.
Día 2 y día 3 desplegaron los 2 satélites de comunicaciones que nos había mostrado.
And on day 4, we were preparing for days 5 and 7, which were very long days because we were going to rendezvous, join up with the satellites, and then do a spacewalk for 6 hours to bring the satellites into the payload bay.
Y el día 4 era el día de preparación, porque el día 5 y el día 6 iban a ser días muy largos porque tenían que hacer una maniobra para hacer una reunión en el espacio con los satélites y después alguien tenía que andar en el espacio para recuperarlos.
Here you see my crewmate, Dale Gardner, with the manned maneuvering unit. He's flying untethered over to the satellite where he is going to dock with this device, and I'm operating the robotic arm that you see the end of it here.
Es su compañero, su colega Dale Gardner, que va a ir de allí sin, no atado, va a ir a los satélites. Ella está operando el brazo robótico.
And here I've operated the robotic arm with Joe Allen in foot restraints on the end of the arm. Dale has maneuvered the satellite over, then he's going to release, and I will maneuver Joe holding the satellite down into the payload bay.
Pues maniobra de 3 astronautas a la vez, ella con el brazo, un compañero por un lado de los satélites, otro del otro lado, y entre los 3 van a bajar y instalarlo en su sitio de almacenaje.
No one had ever managed payloads of this mass before by hand.
Nadie había manejado a mano objetos tan pesados, nunca antes que esto.
And finally, when both satellites were safely secured in the payload bay, Joe and Dale brought out their little for sale sign. I'm sorry, this slides are kind of dark. It says for sale because Lloyd's of London, which was the insurance underwriters, were very excited to get these back and recover some of their loss. Mm-hmm. And both satellites were refurbished and launched a couple of years later on expendable rockets.
Cuando habían recuperado, instalado los satélites, pusieron un cartel a la venta porque tenían interés para reutilizarse y de hecho mucho del material de esos satélites se reutilizó y se lanzó otra vez en nuevos satélites después.
So then, that was days 5 and 7. Day 8 was the day we packed up and got ready to go back home.
Entonces, día 8 tenían que preparar las maletas para bajar, organizarse para volver a tierra.
it was bittersweet because it was so wonderful being in space, but you're also glad to go home and see your family.
Era dulce y amargo a la vez, porque es maravilloso estar en el espacio, pero echas mucho de menos a tu familia.
You take your crew picture on orbit. Oops, wrong one.
Eso es.
Crew picture on orbit and talk to the president and all that kind of thing.
Bueno, tomar la foto obligatoria en el espacio, hablaron con el presidente de los Estados Unidos y cosas de este tipo.
And then the morning of the 9th day, we do our Deorbit Burn. And what that means is you fire the shuttle engines to slow down your velocity so that basically you become a meteor entering the Earth's atmosphere. And hopefully your navigation officer has done his math or her math properly so that we land at the Kennedy Space Center.
Pues entonces, el día 9, ignición de los cohetes en dirección para ralentizar el cohete, entran en la atmósfera, empiezan a pesar, a estar pesados de nuevo, y si los cálculos del oficial o la oficial han estado correctos, llegan otra vez al centro Kennedy de nuevo.
From the time you do the deorbit burn till when you land at the Kennedy Space Center is about 45 minutes.
Bueno, solo 45 minutos entre eso, ignición en el espacio para ralentizar y aterrizaje.
This is a shot a friend of mine took as we went overhead Houston.
Eso es una foto de un amigo cuando estaban sobre Houston.
And then we were the second shuttle to land at the Kennedy Space Center.
El segundo transportador que aterrizó en el centro Kennedy.
And to give you an idea how fast we're traveling, from that picture over Houston to the Kennedy Space Center is about 4 minutes, whereas normally it's about a 2-hour commercial flight.
Sí, pero de la velocidad todavía. El vuelo de Houston a Kennedy en un avión son 2 horas y eso tardaron 4 minutos.
Also, we were the first crew to ever bring anything back from space other than the Apollo astronauts bringing back the moon rocks. And we were met by custom officials asking if we had anything to declare, and here's the form we had to fill out. I'm glad they didn't take it out of our paycheck.
Los primeros astronautas te trae algo del espacio, aparte de las piedras de la Luna. Y entonces al llegar tenían un oficial de la aduana que los obligó a firmar este formulario de declaración.
I felt like a 800-pound, 300-kilo or so gorilla when we landed. I felt so heavy.
Ella tenía un sentido de ser una gorila de 3 veces su propio peso.
And you, sorry.
And
you can see that we're holding on to the handle of the handrail very carefully because we were all very unsteady. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about the physiologic effects.
Se nota que tenían que agarrar la baranda para bajar, porque estaban inestables en ese momento. Y ella va a hablar mucho más de esto más tarde.
So we landed about 7 in the morning, and about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we were back in Houston, flown by a NASA jet, and it was I was really happy to be reunited with my daughter, Kristen.
Llegaron a las 7 de la mañana, a las 2 de la tarde estaba en Houston con un vuelo rápido y ahí con su hija. Bueno, sí.
I'm going to shift gears now and talk a little bit about that amazing view that you see from space. I'd like to share with you some of my favorite photos.
Sorry.
I said I'm going to shift gears now to showing the beautiful view from space, and I want to share some of my favorite photos.
Entonces ya va a simplemente mostrar sus fotos favoritas del espacio.
Every photographer tries to capture a perfect sunrise or sunset, and it reminds me to say that when you go around the Earth, it takes about 90 minutes to go around the Earth. And so every 45 minutes you're seeing either a sunrise or a sunset.
Cada fotógrafo le gusta sacar una foto de un amanecer o atardecer del sol y en órbita, la órbita dura 90 minutos, con lo cual cada 45 minutos tienes tu oportunidad.
The aurora borealis.
La aurora borealis, el norte.
And then this is looking into the Mediterranean, and I've had this slide in my talks for many, many years, and I never realized I was looking at ALMERÍA. ALMERÍA.
Sí, ha tenido esto durante años sin saber, darse cuenta que tenía ALMERÍA.
And then this is a shot of the Sinai Peninsula.
Esa es la península de Sinaí.
And one of the things all astronauts and cosmonauts feel is that from space you don't see any of the borders that you see when you look at a map.
Y todos los astronautas tienen el sentimiento de no ver las fronteras que están en un mapa, no ven fronteras entre países.
And particularly when you're looking at this part of the world, it makes you sad that we can't all learn to not ignore our differences and get along better and take better care of ourselves and our planet.
Sobre todo, de cierta forma, que esta parte del mundo, donde hay conflictos, se entristece pensar que no nos podemos convivir mejor y cuidar el planeta mejor.
The Himalayas, which I loved looking at. And then the daytime views were amazing, but the nighttime views are what were spectacular.
Pues sí, las vistas de día eran muy especiales, pero de noche eran espectaculares.
This is Greece.
Greece.
Tokyo and Tokyo Harbor.
Vale.
The Nile Delta and the Nile and Africa truly is the dark continent.
Ese es el Nilo, pero el espacio África es el continente oscuro, realmente.
All that you see are the lights along the Nile. Unlike the United States, it's lit up like a Christmas tree. You can see the whole outline of Florida looking up the east coast of the United States.
Sí, obviamente los Estados Unidos está iluminado por todos lados, y eso es Florida y la costa este de los Estados Unidos.
This is Los Angeles, as I said, my hometown, and I can almost pick out my home right here.
Pues donde vive ella, Los Ángeles, y casi puede ver su propia casa.
And in the center is Houston, the Johnson Space Center.
Okay, Houston, donde...
And this is the Kennedy Space Center, where these are the two launch pads, the vertical assembly building, and the 15,000-foot runway where the shuttle lands.
Pues eso es el espacio, el centro Kennedy, puedes ver los dos sitios de lanzamiento y la pista de aterrizaje muy largo para el transbordador.
And again, to go from the west coast of the United States to the east coast takes about 8 or 8.5 minutes to give you an idea of how fast orbital velocity is.
Y para ir del costa este al oeste tarda 8 minutos y medio para dar otra vez la idea de la velocidad de la órbita.
And now I just have some other photos I want to share. This is Europe with the city's label, so I don't have to remember all of them. And this is just a shot that I love of Italy. You can clearly see the boot. And then here's a place that you might recognize, but here's ALMERÍA. And another shot of ALMERÍA from space.
You could see the...
I'm going to go back.
ALMERÍA, you could see the greenhouses, I think.
Oops, sorry, let me go back. No, I think,
no,
oh, you think that's
that white block?
I honestly don't know. It could be.
No sé. Si son los invernaderos también.
And then I just think this is a beautiful one of the city. So anyway, that is what you look like from space. Let's see here. Let me get this moving. Okay, I'm going to shift gears now. I'm not going to talk about astronaut training, or we'll be here all night. But I am going to just go through the slides quickly, and if you see anything that you want to ask questions of after, you can ask questions. So,
no va a hablar porque es muy largo, pero esto va a dar un vistazo rápido, y si alguien dice algo, quiere decir algo, pueden preguntar más tarde.
I will say that training for a shuttle mission took anywhere from a year to a year and a half, whereas the space station, which is still on orbit now, training is much longer, takes as long as three years, and you're traveling pretty much all the time. So very different shuttle and space station.
Formarse para el shuttle tarda 1 año y medio, para la estación espacial la formación tarda 3 años, es mucho más complicado.
So we had simulators where we learned to fly the shuttle and where we learned to be on orbit. We also have mission control, where all the flight controllers need to train. We have a flight director who is the boss of mission control. We have a mock-up of the entire International Space Station. We have a large pool where we train for spacewalks. Here you see one of my colleagues getting into the water and training for spacewalks. Physically, that's the hardest thing we do. And the pool is also used for our emergency procedures in case we had to eject from a T-38, which is how the pilots maintain their proficiency. And this is a selfie I took when I was in the T-38. We didn't have iPhones when I was early in my training, and one day I just decided to take a selfie in the T-38. So.
Well, sí. Maybe I can just say a little bit. So, la mayoría de las cosas que han enseñado ahora son simuladores, pero el último no es simuladores, es un caza de T-38 que se usan para practicar eyección de urgencias, por si acaso se necesita algo similar. Okay.
Very briefly, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the physiologic changes in spaceflight. This is not going to be a complete list by any means.
Pues va a hablar, dado que es médica, va a hablar de los cambios fisiológicos al volar al espacio.
This is particularly for the short shuttle missions, not so much for the long-term space station or going to Mars.
Pues eso son para las misiones cortas, no para las largas en la estación espacial o, por ejemplo, para ir a Marte. No, eso para misiones cortas.
One of the main things you feel is the fluid shifts. The fluids that normally pool in your leg, once you're weightless, go into your central venous system, and your body senses it as an overload. So you, over a couple days, urinate and get rid of that fluid. When you look at an astronaut's faces, when they're first on orbit, they're very full. It's really great because it gets rid of all your wrinkles. Unfortunately, they come back.
Que, claro, al no tener peso, el fluido en el cuerpo no se concentra un poco abajo como en gravedad aquí y sube al centro del cuerpo y durante 2 o 3 días el cuerpo reacciona eliminando este fluido en la orina. Durante los primeros 2 días las caras de los astronautas tienen están muy rellenas y si tienen arrugas desaparecen, pero reaparecen al aterrizar.
For the second one, most astronauts, or 60 to 70% of astronauts, suffer what is called space adaptation syndrome the first few days they're on orbit.
Pues 70% de los astronautas sufren un síndrome que se llama adaptación al espacio, el síndrome de adaptación al espacio cuando lleguen. What does it consist of? You're going to describe it, right?
Yes, and the symptoms are very much the same as being seasick. The cause is the fact that your eyes are seeing something different than what your ear is feeling, and there's a conflict, and it makes you have stomach awareness, and if you eat too much, you're probably going to throw up, and if you think throwing up on the ground is unpleasant, let me assure you that throwing up in space is way worse.
Dice que eso realmente es muy similar al mal del mar, porque hay una descoordinación entre los ojos y el equilibrio del oído, y eso causa tendencia de vomitar. Y dice que vomitar en el espacio es especialmente desagradable.
And finally, when you go into space, for those of us who are shorter, you actually grow about an inch. And many astronauts have back pain when they're on orbit because the ligaments stretch.
Sí, los ligamentos se relajan en el espacio y el efecto es un aparente crecimiento del cuerpo por 2 o 3 centímetros, y bastantes astronautas sufren de dolores de la espalda en órbita.
There are many other things to talk about for longer-term space flight, but again, that's almost another whole talk in itself. But you worry about losing muscle mass, losing calcium, losing bone, worrying about radiation, and so there's many other things for long-term flight that we have to deal with, and if you're interested, you can ask me questions.
Hay muchas cosas para los vuelos a más largo plazo que ocurren, por ejemplo, pérdida de músculo, pérdida de calcio en los huesos y los problemas de la radiación, que todos son serios para vuelos largos. Ella puede contestar a preguntas sobre esas cosas.
One of the more interesting changes that we have seen in the last few years, and we never saw it on shuttle flights, and we've only seen it on the longer space station flights, is changes in astronauts' vision.
Lo que está ocurriendo ahora en la estación espacial, los vuelos largos, es cambios en el funcionamiento del ojo, que no ocurrieron en el transbordador.
And unfortunately, the change is not to get better vision, but to have worse vision.
Y eso no es mejorar la visión, sino deteriorar la visión.
And we think it's due to the fluid shifts, raising the pressure in the eyeball, and we're doing lots of research to try to understand which people get it. Can we correct it in some way? Is it progressive or does it stop? And so there's a lot of ongoing research to answer all these questions.
Sí, está asociado con cambio de fluido en el ojo, y están haciendo mucha investigación para ver cómo contrarrestar eso.
I want to shift gears again now and just briefly mention the space station program. I was very fortunate to be the chief of the space station branch at the very beginning when we started building the space station in November and December of 1998, when we launched the first elements of the space station.
You were head of the space station?
I was head of the space station branch in the astronaut office.
Okay. Cuando lanzaron los primeros elementos de la estación espacial, ella era la jefa, la directora del grupo de astronautas formándose para la estación espacial.
The first cruise launched to the International Space Station in October of 2000.
El primer grupo lanzó a la estación en el año 2000
and it's been continuously manned since that time, with
Yeah.
varying numbers of crew.
y desde entonces siempre ha habido alguien, o varias personas, números diferentes, pero siempre tripulada la estación.
I think the space station is one of the most amazing things that humans has created. On this trip, I've been very privileged to visit many wonderful places like Ephesus and all the old places in Athens and in Istanbul. But I still, and they are amazing. It amazes me what people are capable of. And I think the International Space Station is just another example of the ingenuity of the human spirit.
Considera que la estación espacial es un ejemplo de un logro humano cultural y científico, pero también cultural. Está comparando con logros históricos de la civilización, como puede ver en Atenas o otros sitios históricos.
The space station is a partnership with all of our international partners, including ESA, the European Space Agency, the Japanese Space Agency, Canada. I've lost track of how many nations. It says 15 partners in 63 countries. It's about the size of a 6-bedroom house. The crew varies from a crew of 3 to a crew now of 7, which I'll explain in a minute. And I just think this is a beautiful picture that the shuttle took of the space station as it was backing away.
Pues el programa de la Estación Espacial es un programa magnífico de 15 países y con colaboración absoluta en los países, diferentes agencias espaciales, y la tripulación varía entre 3 y 7.
And just to give you a glimpse into how complex operating a station is, these are all the different vehicles that go up and either dock or berth with the space station.
Entonces,
the Crew Dragon, Cygnus as the supply ship, the Soyuz brings people, the Crew Dragon brings people. These are supply ships, and it's very complicated managing all these different vehicles.
Sí, esta imagen muestra la llegada de diferentes vehículos. Con tripulación, el Dragon y el Soyuz, los otros son de carga. Y es muy complicado maniobrar todo eso.
So the Space Shuttle stopped flying in July of 2011 after 135 flights.
Después de 135 vuelos, el programa del Shuttle dejó de funcionar en 2011. No había más vuelos del Shuttle.
It flew for 30 years. This is one of my favorite shots of the shuttle on the pad towards the end of the program.
Okay. Eso es el lanzamiento de un transportador hacia el final del programa.
After that, the United States had no way to send astronauts in space up to the International Space Station.
Después del transportador, los Estados Unidos no tenían forma de mandar astronautas a la estación espacial.
So we had to rely on our Russian partners to launch on the Soyuz out of Baikonur.
Entonces, tenían que fiarse, fiaban de sus colegas soviéticos para lanzar desde su punto en Baikal.
At the cost of from 40 million to later years 70 million per astronaut.
El coste era $40 millones hasta 70 por astronauta.
I'd just like to mention here how far the women in the space program have come. This is a photograph taken about 3 years ago on International Women's Day of all the women in the office at that time, with Peggy Whitson in the background. She's the commander on board the International Space Station. She was busy working and she just stopped real quickly to take this photo with us.
Pues eso es para mostrar el progreso de la participación femenina en el espacio. Eso fue el grupo en la oficina de los astronautas en Día de la Mujer. What year was that? This year?
About 3 years ago.
Hace 3 años. Y también la comandante actual del espacio, de la estación espacial también.
Peggy Whitson. Peggy Whitson. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes. And then about a year and a half ago now, Jessica Meir and Christine Koch did the first all-female spacewalk.
Pues esto hace un año, estas dos astronautas, es la primera versión de andar en el espacio de solamente dos mujeres.
And during the spacewalk, my other colleague was Stephanie Wilson was the CAPCOM in mission control.
Y durante este proceso, la comunicación, encargada de la comunicación en control de la misión era esta otra mujer.
And we have many female flight directors, so I'm very proud of how far women have come since the first 6 of us were selected.
Hay muchos directores de vuelo que son mujeres. Ella está muy orgullosa del progreso de las mujeres en este campo.
And I just want to mention, you also have Pedro Duque and Mike Lopez Algria, who are Spanish astronauts. So many of you young folks in the audience can aspire to follow in their footsteps.
Nombrando y mostrando Pedro Duque, que ha venido aquí, que es un astronauta español, y Mike López de Alegría, Miguel López de Alegría, que es de origen español, aunque ha venido aquí también a las jornadas.
Very quickly now, I'm just going to show you very briefly what is going on in the United States now in our space program.
Ahora va brevemente a describir el programa actual en el espacio.
As I said, we didn't have, for many years, our own launch vehicle to take astronauts to the International Space Station. So now we have 2, the SpaceX Crew Dragon and the Boeing Starliner.
Okay. Después de un intervalo sin tener un cohete para ir al espacio, ahora hay 2 en Estados Unidos, el Boeing Starliner y el SpaceX Crew Dragon.
I'm sure many of you heard about a year ago in May we had the first manned launch of the Crew Dragon, the DM-2 mission, with Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken.
Okay. Eso fue hace 2 años, el primer lanzamiento del Crew Dragon con estos 2 astronautas.
And here they are in the Crew Dragon getting ready to launch, and this was their liftoff, as I said, in May of last year.
Sí, y el lanzamiento mismo allí.
And we're very happy to be able to once again launch astronauts from U.S. soil.
Claro, siendo americana, ella está muy contenta de que ahora Estados Unidos tiene capacidad de lanzar.
So here that they joined, this crew was the crew on board the International Space Station, and they joined the crew up there testing the SpaceX Dragon for about 4 months.
Y entonces llegaron a la estación espacial, los 3 y ellos 2 nuevos, y comprobaron el Crew Dragon, el test de 4 meses.
And after 4 months, they landed, had a flawless landing in the Gulf of Mexico because the weather was bad off the coast of Florida.
Eso es una vuelta del Crew Dragon cerca de la costa de Florida, en el Golfo de México.
And this is the current crew that flew up to the International Space Station.
Esa es la tripulación actual en la estación espacial.
Here you see them walking out of that same door that you saw our crew walk out of all these many years later.
Están saliendo de la misma puerta, el mismo edificio donde ella salió hace tantos años.
I think their suits are a little fancier than ours, though, thanks to Elon Musk. And this is what they look like inside the Crew Dragon.
Están dentro del Crew Dragon.
They had a night launch, and here you see the Crew Dragon docked. Whoops, what did I
Ese es el Crew Dragon ya acoplado a la estación espacial.
docked to the International Space Station. And this is the entire crew. So one crew comes up on the Soyuz, 3 people on the Soyuz, 4 people on the Dragon.
Entonces, esa es la tripulación total, entera. Una parte que ha llegado en el Soyuz y otra parte en el Crew Dragon.
And then Boeing is working on another capsule vehicle. They've had some problems with their vehicle, but I'm sure they will solve them. And eventually then we will have 2 capsules to go to the International Space Station.
Bueno, esa es la cápsula de Boeing, aunque tienen problemas en su programa, pero estos problemas se resolverán y tendrán 2 formas de llegar a la estación.
It will launch on an Atlas rocket.
Eso va a lanzarse en un cohete Atlas, un clásico.
So that's what's happening in the commercial world. And then NASA is building the Orion vehicle that is designed not to go to low Earth orbit, but to go beyond low Earth orbit.
La NASA está diseñando este vehículo que se llama Orion, no para orbitar cerca de la Tierra, sino para ir más allá.
And here you see this looks like a bad result, but it's not. It's a successful test of the abort system of the Orion vehicle.
Es una prueba del sistema de abortar del vehículo Orion.
And the biggest rocket ever designed is being built, and we're going to have the first unmanned test. Hopefully, they're saying December of this year. I doubt that, but probably early next year.
Y están construyendo el cohete más potente de nunca, y esto se va a comprobar en principio en diciembre, y lo dudo que probablemente el año que viene.
So just to put these are mock-ups of the 3 vehicles. So this is the Spacex Dragon, the Boeing Starliner, and the Orion vehicle. These 2 go to the space station. The Orion is going to be part of the Artemis program, which is the new program to go back to the moon.
Entonces, estos son are they real or are they just
these are mock-ups.
Models? Son 3 modelos de los vehículos. Esos 2 van a la estación espacial y Orion va a formar parte del programa Artemis que va a la Luna.
And hopefully the idea, of course, is we want to go back to the moon, build a base, to learn all the things we need to learn, to live on another body from Earth, with the ultimate goal, of course, being to go to Mars.
Entonces, el programa al principio va a ir adaptándose para astronautas vivir tiempo en la Luna, pero el objetivo final es preparar tripulaciones para ir a Marte. Ese es el final, pero a más largo plazo.
And I know there are many people here who could talk about all the difficulties of going to Mars, but I just like this visual representation taken by one of the Mars rovers. This is Earth from Mars, so that you get an idea of just how far away it is and how complicated it is going to be, which is why I think and NASA thinks we need to go to the moon first.
Pues esta imagen de la Tierra obtenida por uno de los vehículos rover que andan robóticamente por ahí en Marte, ilustra la distancia de la Tierra y la lejanía y explica por qué hay que hacer muchísima preparación en la Luna antes de atreverse para ir a Marte.
I thought I would just very briefly tell you a bit about what's happened to me over the years since I flew. I had 2 daughters, Kristen and Kara, who both grew up in this unusual world of 2 parents being astronauts.
va a dar algunos pinceladas de su propia vida. Esas son sus dos hijas, Christine y Cara, que crecían en este mundo raro, ambos padres astronautas.
Kristen then eventually became a White House correspondent covering the Trump administration.
Christine iba a ser corresponsal en la Casa Blanca durante la época del presidente Trump.
And now she was recently hired to cover space and defense for CNN. And I think it's such an exciting time. I don't have time to talk about Blue Origin and Spacex and Virgin Galactic, but someday maybe she can come talk to you about all those things because she's meeting all these people.
Pues esto es, bueno, relacionado un poco con lo que yo enseñé ayer. Después del vuelo de Captain Kirk y Jeff Bezos, ella fue la corresponsal de CNN que los entrevistó. Y su madre orgullosamente dice que ella podría venir a hablar mucho de estas cosas a nosotros, y ella va a saber mucho.
And my younger daughter took a different pathway. She's in finance, so maybe she'll be one of those people who can buy a seat into space.
Pues la hija menor no está directamente vinculada con nada, pero está en finanzas y quizás llegará a poder comprar un asiento en un cohete al espacio.
So I failed getting my daughters to become astronauts. So now I'm working on my granddaughter.
Pues no consiguió que sus hijas querían ser astronautas, pero está haciendo un trabajo con la nieta.
The hardest talk I ever gave is to a group of 2 to 3-year-olds.
What took the
The
hardest?
most difficult talk is
La charla más difícil que ha tenido fue a un grupo de niños de 2 y 3 años.
Right. Let me see. And then just recently I took her to see Space Shuttle Discovery in the Smithsonian Museum, so I'm working really hard on her. You can see this is Space Shuttle Discovery, and Tara and I had a wonderful time. And then this is my my grandson who just came along, and again, I'm going to see what I can do to get them interested in space.
Ese es el nieto, muy reciente, y ella va a hacer todo lo que pueda para guiarle hacia el espacio.
And I hope some of the young folks in the audience will be excited about space from listening.
Ella espera que algunos de los jóvenes aquí se entusiasmarán para el tema del espacio también.
I retired from NASA in 2017. This is a picture where they're giving me my plaque.
Ella se jubiló de la NASA en 2017. Esa es su firma y obviamente la carta de su jubilación.
And I've had many wonderful things happen. And so I like to tell young children, you know, when you're doing your math homework and your science homework, you never know what the future holds, because I went on a cruise with my high school friends to celebrate my retirement. This was the cake they had made for me.
Pues ella dice que cuando eres joven y te dan deberes de matemáticas o de ciencia, mejor hacerlos bien porque nunca sabes a dónde van a llevarte. Y eso fue la carta de hecho de sus compañeros al jubilarse, que hicieron en un crucero para ella, para su jubilación.
After that cruise, I was contacted by Viking, and they asked me to be the godmother of their next ocean ship, which I named Orion.
Entonces estaba después contactada por la compañía de cruceros Viking, y ella es la madrina de uno de sus barcos, y ella lo nombró Orion.
They had even a cardinal from the Vatican come to bless the ship when we had the naming ceremony.
Eso. Llegó un cardenal al Vaticano para bendecir el barco durante la ceremonia de nombramiento.
an amazing fireworks display.
Fuegos artificiales.
But I had no idea when I was 12 years old wanting to be an astronaut that all these amazing things were going to happen.
Ella no tenía la más mínima idea, como una niña de 12 años, de las cosas fantásticas que le iban a ocurrir.
And I'd like to close with this slide.
Y terminar con esta.
My grandmother passed away in 2003 at the age of 105.
Su abuela se murió en
I've got my grandmother.
what year?
2003 at
Su
105.
abuela se murió en 2003 con la edad de 105.
She was born in 1898 during the horse and buggy days.
Ella nació en 1898, en época solamente de coches con caballos.
Saw the development of aviation and the first man walking on the moon.
Entonces pasó por la edad de la aviación.
To seeing her granddaughter launch into space.
Y para ver su propia nieta lanzada al espacio.
But the rate of change occurring now in technology, I have no idea what some of the young people in the audience will see if they are fortunate enough to live to be 100 and 105 years. It's amazing, and you can tell just listening some of the talks earlier this week by John and Anna and some of the other speakers. I think it's really amazing, and I really urge the young folks in the audience to study hard and dream big and follow your dreams. And with that, I think I'll stop talking.
Entonces, dice que los cambios han sido tantos en 105 años, nadie sabe lo que va a pasar a los que son jóvenes ahora, si viven a mucha edad, pero es muy importante trabajar mucho y seguir el sueño que tienes. Ese es su deseo para todas las personas aquí.
And thank you once again for coming out on such a very difficult night. I really appreciate it, and I hope it was worth the big risk you took. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for staying here this night. I'm sorry when my English is not good, but I will like to try to make a question. In all your lifetime, what is the more difficult to do or to be astronaut?
What is the most difficult thing to do to be an astronaut? By the way, your English is much better than my Spanish, so there's a couple things. One is just the amount of material you need to know to be a good astronaut. But I think the hardest thing is learning to believe in yourself. I think when you're first in college and you're just learning, and you first do research in a laboratory, and you first become a doctor, you think everybody else is smarter and better than you. And overcoming that feeling and getting confidence in yourself, I think, is really hard. Physically, working in the spacesuit, that's far and away the hardest thing that I've ever done physically. The other hardest thing was leaving my daughter when she was 14 months. That was very, very difficult. And then the really hardest thing I think I ever did was I took a 7-year leave of absence when my second daughter was born. And I didn't plan it that way, but it wound up being 7 years, and then I wound up going back. And going back after being away for 7 years was really probably the hardest thing I'd ever done.
Bueno, la cosa más difícil que ha hecho, bueno, resulta que son 5, pero bueno, que una es la gran cantidad de conocimiento total que tiene que dominar para ser astronauta. Después dijo, la cosa realmente más difícil era llegar a creer en ella misma cuando tenía 12 años y después al entrar en cada etapa de su carrera, de doctora, etc., científica y después astronauta, siempre pensando de antemano que los otros eran mejores que ella y cómo puede tener éxito, pero al final con mucho esfuerzo y determinación, exactamente los mismos sentimientos que Jocelyn Bell, que ella llegó a lo mejor. Y después, la cosa más difícil es trabajar en un traje espacial. Eso también es muy difícil. Y después, la otra cosa más difícil era dejar ser astronauta durante 7 años después del nacimiento de su segunda hija. Ella no sabía que iba a ser 7 años. Y volver. Eso resulta muy difícil, pero lo hizo. Okay.
Buenas noches. Tengo una pregunta y una hipótesis. La pregunta es, quisiera saber si en el espacio se producen cambios en el ciclo menstrual de la mujer.
Okay.
¿Cómo sería en el espacio un embarazo y un parto? Y si el bebé que naciese en el espacio sería diferente de un bebé nacido en la Tierra.
Okay. Interesting questions. First of all, she said, is there any effect of being in space on your menstrual cycle? And then she said, what would be the difficulties of giving birth in space, and whether a baby born in space would have significant differences to a baby born on the ground?
Well, the first question, most female astronauts that fly in space choose to suppress by taking birth control pills. And that is what I did, so that you don't have, that's one less thing you have to worry about when you're on orbit. So I'm not sure, to my knowledge, there's never been a formal study about how the menstrual cycle is affected. I'm pretty sure no one has, and they leave it to each of us to discuss things with our flight surgeon to decide how we want it. Personally, that's what I did. I didn't want to have to deal with it.
Or did you say suppress?
Suppress it, just by taking birth control pills.
Okay.
Just take them, you don't have any periods.
Let me...
Okay.
Bueno, sí, en muy corta duración toman medicamentos para suprimir la menstruación, para evitar problemas. Y a más largo plazo discuten con sus médicos que los avisan, etcétera, lo que es mejor hacer.
They have done some studies on chicken embryos and embryos that were fairly far along. And I don't know all the details of it, but the embryos that were fairly far along developed normally, but an early embryo did not develop normally.
No han hecho